Good day. Before I proceed with my main video, just a brief housekeeping matter. It's come to my attention, and I'm grateful to the various people who pointed it out, that there is someone out there who is currently posting videos and opening channels and commenting on threads of my own videos who claims to be me. Well, he or she obviously is not me. And can I make it absolutely clear that the only programs, the only videos in which I appear and which are by myself are those on this channel. The complete ones, not sometimes garbled, pasted together excerpts from these videos, which can be made to give rather different interpretations of events than the ones I actually give. And of course, and as a matter of fact, I have a rule which is not to comment directly on threads, precisely because I think that threads should be left open for you, the community, to comment on. So any comment on a thread, at least on a YouTube thread, you can be certain is not mine. Now, obviously, we're going to look at taking action about this person or persons who are behind this thing. But in the meantime, please be aware, as I said, that there are things circulating that have been put together by someone else other than myself. Now, the second is that I got lots of feedback, very welcome, excellent feedback from my video yesterday on the topic of drones. And if you remember, I discussed the possibility over the course of that video that some of these drones that have been carrying out attacks in Crimea might actually have been sent by Ukraine from Ukrainian-controlled territory. But I did wonder whether drones, rather small drones, would be capable of operating over such extended ranges. Well, I got a mass of information as a result, and interestingly, for once, there appears to be a general consensus about this, which is that yes, there are drones, particularly agricultural drones used for agricultural use, which could be adapted and which could indeed operate over such distances. At least mechanically, their engines could be made so that they could continue to operate over ranges of 200 kilometers, but that there would be serious problems, at least to the extent that we know, in terms of wireless connectivity over such long ranges. Now, one person who has contacted me, who regularly contacts me from India and who I understand has a military background, has suggested that there might be ways using satellite Wi-Fi available to Ukraine, for example, via Elon Musk's complex network, that there might be ways around this problem, though even he was not sure. But anyway, conceivably it's possible, but there are technical challenges that might stand in the way. Now, I want to stress, even if there are ways around those technical challenges, we don't actually know that this is happening, but it is useful and it is extremely instructive to get this information. And I suspect that the fact that these are probably adaptations of agricultural drones is indeed, in fact, the kind of drones that we are looking at. Now, the other thing, and this comes again from this person in India, he's made some very interesting comments about the attack on the ammunition depot, and I would reiterate again that this person has a military background, and he makes the point that this was equipment, this ammunition depot was equipment that had just come off a train and was lying on a railway siding with grad trucks and ammunition that was attacked. And that is consistent, by the way, fully consistent. Indeed, it's identical to the video imagery which I have shown. seen rather, and this person then goes on to say sometimes equipment is sent by train, but the troops are sent separately by road, etc. So it may have been lying, as the troops had not reached there yet to pick it up. The local commander should have provided a guard, as is the practice, but due to paucity of manpower, this is sometimes what happens. The fact that this ammunition depot was left unguarded. And I think that is actually a very good explanation of what happened. The one thing that the Russians and the Allied forces have been short of in Ukraine is not ammunition. They have vast, almost unlimited stocks of this, and their arms industry seems to be churning out artillery shells and missiles, and by the way, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles at enormous volumes. What the Russians have been lacking in Ukraine is infantry. And there are various reasons for this, one of which is that the Russians have not carried out that famed mobilization that we've been hearing so much about. So, given that there are gaps in the infantry, that explains to some extent the incremental nature of the Russian advances, but it may also explain why on this particular occasion this ammunition depot with the Grad trucks and their ammo lying in open fields near a railway siding, that the reason why these vehicles and that ammunition was basically unguarded was because the ability to provide guards is limited due to the lack of manpower to provide it. Now, I would say that we're getting more and more reports, incremental reports, that the Russians are indeed building up brigades, new brigades of troops in the interior of Russia, drawn from volunteers in Russia itself, drawn from volunteers in these areas in southwestern Ukraine that the Russians have alternatively occupied or liberated, depending on your point of view. And by some reports, something like 18 such brigades are being formed. And it seems, by the way, that they're not going to be part of the regular army, but rather they're going to be part of the National Guard organization, of which one particular force is the Chechen units, which we have been seeing operating with such prominence. And these will be light infantry brigades. They will have more equipment, significantly more equipment than some of the Ukrainian brigades that they are pitted against, but they will no doubt spearhead some of the urban assaults on places like Odessa and Kharkov when the time comes to capture those cities, something which I, by the way, consider inevitable. But they will also be used, they will also release people to guard ammunition dumps and deal with those sort of things. Anyway, I think, as I said, we've had quite a lot of information now about the kind of drones that are being used, and I want to, by the way, thank the many people who've written and commented on the subject, both in emails to me and on the threads of the video. So the other thing I wanted to say from this point on is that now I think this is the moment for me to turn to the actual topic of this video, which again, obviously, is primarily about the conflict in Ukraine. Yesterday, I said that there had been quite heavy fog of war, and this had led to some claims in that, the things had been, the fighting had reached some kind of pause or standstill. I queried over the course of the video whether that was really the case, and in fact, since I made that video, there's been an absolute deluge of news, all of which points to significant Russian advances. And it now seems to be confirmed, for example, that the Russians are deep inside Soledar, that they're capturing lots of areas around Soledar, that they've captured more areas south and west of Bakhmut city, that they are closing in indeed on Ugledar, and that they're advancing significantly in the area northwest of Kharkiv. And in fact, if you go to the military summary channel, which goes through all of this in immense detail, far greater detail than I can do, well, then you get a sense that actually, over the last couple of hours, the Russians have made very significant advances in the fighting in Donbass. They seem to be pushing purposefully and very effectively forward in all directions. And as Dima, the person who runs the military summary channel, whom we were honored, by the way, to do a video with on the Duran some time ago, as he pointed out, this may all look incremental, but with more and more of these important settlements being taken, the Ukrainian position begins to look increasingly precarious, and eventually, as happened in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk fighting, and previously before that in Mariupol, you will suddenly see a sudden collapse of Ukrainian positions. And the thing that perhaps stood out for me most starkly from all of these accounts is that the Russians and their allies seem to be making very significant advances, especially in the heavily fortified areas opposite Donetsk city. And they seem to be making significant progress to encircling many of the Ukrainian troops located in these fortified areas, specifically in the important fortified town, or perhaps more properly suburb of Donetsk city, which is Avdiivka, where much of the shelling of Donetsk city has been launched from, and also a little further south there. And these look like they're not really mini cauldrons, they're going to be significant cauldrons once they are formed, if the Ukrainians continue their usual pattern of trying to hold on to these places after the roads are cut and resupply becomes impossible. So it does increasingly look as if the Russians are making real progress, significant progress in Donbass. Now, I should say that literally a second before I started making this video, I saw further reports that the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has been talking, and that supposedly he's given a figure of 150,000 killed as the total number of dead Ukrainian fighters in this battle. Well, I can't confirm that. It could be that Shoigu didn't say that, or it could be that he's exaggerating. But I will say that I did a program, which will no doubt be appearing fairly soon, on the Duran with Glenn Deason and Scott Ritter yesterday, in which Scott gave his own estimates of Ukrainian losses. And he put Ukrainian losses, the amount numbers of dead Ukrainians, significantly below that, around half that figure, around 80,000. But 80,000 would be a very, very large number of people. It would be the equivalent of the ground forces, the total ground forces of the British Army, not just the infantry, but the entire ground forces of the British Army. And that seems an astonishing high casualty rate for the Ukrainians in this war. So, these are estimates. I'm not saying that they're accurate figures. I can't corroborate them, but they do give one a sense, perhaps, of the intensity of the fighting that is taking place in Donbass and of the extremely high losses that Ukraine is suffering. And Scott Ritter made guesses. I think that they are perhaps more than guesses. They're more like calculations of Russian losses, and they're only a fraction of those that Ukraine seems to be suffering. And I think that is almost certainly true. And it does seem to me that the attrition of Ukraine is absorbing through all of this is incredibly, astonishingly high. Well, we'll see to what extent Ukraine can continue to absorb losses on this scale. Meanwhile, I just wanted to make one observation about British media coverage of the fighting. The British Ministry of Defence has, for the first time over some period of time, given what might be called a battlefield report. It talks about minimal progress by the Russians, which is always the word it uses, but in fact it's the first time it's admitting that the Russians are indeed advancing in Donbass. And as we see, the progress, even if in terms of distances it may not be huge, it is actually highly consequential. And there was also an extraordinary article in The Economist which said that Ukraine might be ill-advised to launch an offensive in Kherson region at this time. And I have to say, I found that expression ill-advised from The Economist really quite astonishing, because it's been obvious to me for weeks now that it's the British who've been zealously promoting this offensive in Kherson region. And here we now see a British publication, The Economist, coming and advising the Ukrainians that an offensive in Kherson region would be ill-advised. Well, I'm not going to comment further on that. Few more things. For the moment, there were no further significant attacks in Crimea. The Russian air defenses appear to have been successful in intercepting the various drone attacks that were launched against Crimea. The Russians also claim that their air defenses were successful in shooting down HIMARS missiles, which were again launched against the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, the one which has the rail and road links which is undoubtedly operating and which crosses the Dnieper River near Kherson. And in addition, all the warnings and threats of a major attack or accident or provocation which each side made against the other with respect to the Zaporozhye nuclear power station, well, nothing there appears to have happened of any significance. There was some more Ukrainian shelling of the nuclear power station, but the Russians claimed that they were able to deal with it, that their air defense systems around the Zaporozhye nuclear power station have been upgraded. Now, on the topic of the Zaporozhye nuclear power station, there was a really rather strange twist, because, of course, Erdogan, as we know, met with Zelensky and is apparently due to speak to Vladimir Putin. And one of the topics is going to be the nuclear power station. I discussed all of this in my video yesterday. But of course, this all appears to have made someone else extremely jealous. And the person who has been made jealous is our old friend, President Macron of France. Apparently, the idea that Erdogan might steal the show as mediator between the Russians and the Ukrainians is something that Macron's vanity can't stomach. That was the role that he was trying to play, both before and at earlier stages during the war. And though he's been sulking in his tent for some time since, especially since the legislative elections back in June, well, he was back on the phone to Putin yesterday. I'm not going to waste time reading out the readout. Nothing of any substance, as far as I could see, was discussed. It looked increasingly to me like another vanity project by Macron. I think that Macron perhaps doesn't quite realize the extent to which his attempts to mediate, or his pretended attempts to mediate with the Russians, especially before the start of the war, has burnt up his credibility in the Kremlin. The Russians received him on various occasions in January and February of this year, in the run-up to the war. He gave enormously long press conferences. He spoke for hours with Putin. He came up with all kinds of elaborate sentences and gave every indication to the Russians that he could see their point of view, that he even agreed with their point of view. But in the end, he came up with nothing substantive. And the Russians have decided that Macron, so far as his diplomatic efforts are concerned, is, to use rather a crude phrase, someone who's all hat but no trousers. So Putin will, of course, pick up the telephone and will listen to whatever Macron has to say to him, but then he will put the telephone down when Macron has ceased speaking and will go on doing whatever he wants or thinks he needs to do. Erdogan, Putin listens to, because Erdogan, whatever one may feel about him, he does actually act on the things that he says. Can't always be trusted, but he is a real player. Macron, by contrast, is all talk. Lots of talk. Putin actually said over the course of the televised Security Council meeting, which took place on the 21st of February, that Macron had kept him up all night long to no useful purpose. But anyway, there we are. Now, all of this gives us a sense of the direction of the war. At the moment, as I said, the Russians are continuing to make very significant advances. The military summary channel thinks, and I'm no doubt that this is correct, that we're going to see dramatic developments in Donbass, like we saw in Lugansk region with the fall of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk before very long. That this will be a sudden collapse, and I think he's right. I think this is exactly where we're heading. Events are exactly repeating themselves. Now, the Biden administration, for its part, has responded to all of this by supplying Ukraine with more weapons. Now, at the moment, it's all ammunition, except, of course, I did read a report that the US is now actually decided to provide Ukraine with some of these Grey Eagle drones after all. Now, I can't fully confirm that it's true, but I suspect it is. And I also suspect that before very long, we're going to see the Biden administration provide Ukraine with these ATACMS missiles with their 300-kilometer range. I think this is eventually going to come. And I think the reason is that the administration can see the trajectory of travel in Ukraine. It can see that Ukraine is facing disaster in Donbass and is at a standstill in southwest Ukraine, and is now at very real risk of losing the important town of Ugledar in southern Donetsk region, which could also, by the way, open the way to an attack on the important city of Zaporozhye. And of course that there's all those advances in Kherson region too, in Kharkiv region too, Russian advances in Kharkiv region too. So I think that they will not want to see Ukraine visibly collapse and be defeated in the run-up to the November midterms. So probably overruling what I suspect are growing objections from the uniformed military, we're going to see more and more of these weapon systems being sent to Ukraine, though I doubt that they will make any significant difference to the direction of the war. But this now, I think, is the priority, not to enable Ukraine to win, but to enable Ukraine to hold out until the midterms. In other words, to prolong the war, to help the administration through its electoral difficulties. That is now, I suspect, the overriding priority. And I'm afraid there is a good chance that it will lead to an escalation. In addition, we've now seen something happen which I've been suspecting for a very long time. A few days ago, about a week ago, the Russians started to report that Ukrainian aircraft had launched a HARM, H-A-R-M, anti-radar missile against them. They'd actually collected the debris, and they were able to show that this missile, which is a US-made missile, had actually been deployed and used by the Ukrainian Air Force, something which would require significant adaptation to the kind of Soviet-era aircraft that Ukraine is using. Now, this had not been announced by the United States at the time when the Russians displayed this system, this HARM missile. And the United States, after some hesitation, did acknowledge that it had indeed supplied this HARM missile. And in the latest package, apparently the United States is confirming that it is in fact supplying HARM missiles to Ukraine. Now, I have suspected for some time that the United States has been supplying weapon systems to Ukraine, and only afterwards, only after the weapon systems have been supplied and in some cases have gone into operation, has this been confirmed publicly. And moreover, I'm going to make a guess. I think this has been happening for a very long time. I think this started to happen before the war began. In other words, I suspect that weapons deliveries to Ukraine started to be stepped up from the United States, perhaps as long ago as the summer. After, in other words, that brief crisis in the spring of last year, when Ukraine looked like it was about to launch an attack on Donbass, and the Russians mobilized 100,000 men in response, and the crisis seemed to have been averted after a telephone call between Biden and Putin, which led to a brief but very inconclusive summit in Geneva. I suspect that the United States actually used, or at least the administration, used that brief period, that those few months that between that event and the start of the war, to step up weapons deliveries to Ukraine. I want to stress, I can't prove it, but that is what I think. And one of the things that I noticed at the time was that the Russians were vigorously complaining throughout that period that the United States was, as they said, stuffing Ukraine with weapons systems, and there was no visible confirmation of that from the American side. But I suspect what was happening was that the Russians were picking up the fact, were detecting the fact that the United States was increasing supplies of weapon systems like javelins and stingers and all those things to Ukraine, and that this was happening well before the war began. So it's quite likely, for example, that other systems like Grey Eagle drones have already been supplied to Ukraine. I wouldn't be surprised if we found out that ATACMS missiles have already been supplied to Ukraine or are being supplied to Ukraine, and that this will happen before those announcements are made. Anyway, that's a little bit of history. Now, again, just to reiterate, this is my own speculation, but I think that it's fairly well substantiated. I believe it is true. Now, there's been a very interesting development on the other front, which is the front of the economic war. And that is that there's been a very interesting article in the Financial Times written by somebody called Helen Thompson. Now, I should say that the Financial Times is, of course, the newspaper of the business community, not just in Britain, but it's also widely read in Europe, across Europe as well. It's also very close to the Biden administration, by the way, and its politics are rigidly anti-Russian. They have a very strong neocon flavour. And this article by Helen Thompson finally appears to acknowledge something which the West has up to now been very reluctant to do, which is that it is losing the economic war. Now, there have been a few articles in the past which have sort of hinted at this. There was an article, for example, by Larry Elliott in The Guardian, who's The Guardian's economic editor, who was saying that there has to be a deal because this isn't a sustainable position. But Larry Elliott is politically well to the left, and the old left, I should say. He was a sympathiser of Jeremy Corbyn's, for example. Perhaps he's not an authoritative voice. An article like this in the Financial Times by Helen Thompson, who's somebody I don't know, by the way, but it seems to me a stronger indicator that that there's an acknowledgement that things are going wrong, and that this can't be kept going for very much longer. And the interesting thing is that this article appeared in conjunction with an editorial in the Financial Times. Now, the editorial, the Financial Times editorial, I'm not going to read it, but it says that Russia's economy is staggering, but still on its feet. It appeared to acknowledge, in other words, well, it does acknowledge, though it doesn't like to say to what extent, but it acknowledges the fact that the sanctions have not dealt the knockout blow to the Russian economy that many people in the West had anticipated and, of course, had hoped. It's still on its feet, I mean, it talks about, how it's going to be crippled in the long term because of the technology bans and all of that. But there's been no sanctions silver bullet which has killed off the bear. So what happens in the long term is not really going to affect the situation in the immediate term. And it's the immediate term issues that Helen Thompson, who we're told is a professor of political economy at Cambridge University, is talking about in this article that's appeared in the Financial Times. And I'm going to read this article, even though it is behind a paywall, because I think it's very consequential. And it's also, in my opinion, an extremely good piece of analysis. So I'm going to read it both because it's a good piece of analysis and also because it may be giving some indication of the kind of debates that are now going on especially in Europe's chancelleries behind the scenes. And it reads as follows. Across the world, politicians are ever more desperately looking to contain the explosive consequences of the energy crisis. In those parts of Asia, the Middle East and Africa, already mired in multiple economic and political difficulties, the crisis is proving catastrophic. Those who import liquid natural gas must now compete with European latecomers to the LNG market seeking an alternative to pipelined Russian gas. In early summer, Pakistan was unable to complete a single LNG tender. In poor countries, a large proportion of the state's resources go on subsidizing energy consumption. At prevailing prices, some cannot. Earlier this month, the Sri Lankan Electricity Board imposed a 264% increase on the country's poorest energy users. In Europe, governments want to alleviate the dire pressures on households as well as energy-intensive and small businesses while letting spiraling prices pleased to consume less and fear about the coming winter drive down demand. Quite an interesting admission, by the way. Fiscally, this means state funding to reduce rising energy bills by subsidizing distributors, as in France, or transferring money to citizens to pay those bills, as in the UK. What is not available anywhere is a quick means for increasing the physical supply of energy. That is the key. That's the key sentence. You can do all kinds of things to try and help people, but you have to spend vast amounts of money to do it, and you can't increase supply. So you are committed to spending money constantly, and this is having massive effects on government budgets in the West, and is causing deepening crises in the global South, and of course is causing inflation to spike. Anyway, to continue, this crisis is not an inadvertent consequence of the pandemic or Russia's brutal war against Ukraine. It is much deeper roots in two structural problems. First, unpalatable as this reality is for climate and ecological reasons, world economic growth still requires fossil fuel production. Now that's a professor, Cambridge University, writing this in the Financial Times. If you've been following my videos closely, you will know that one other person made exactly that same point a few weeks ago at a conference in the Kremlin. That person was, of course, Vladimir Putin, President of Russia and arch bogey figure at the moment in the West. But anyway, to continue, without more investment and exploration, there is unlikely to be sufficient supply in the medium term to meet likely demand. The present gas crisis has its origins in the Chinese-driven surge in gas consumption during 2021. Demand grew so rapidly that it was only available for European and Asian purchase at very high prices. Meanwhile, respite from oil prices this year has only materialized when the economic data from China is unpropitious. In the International Energy Agency's judgment, it is quite possible that global oil production will be inadequate to meet demand as soon as next year. Now, the Chinese government is now taking steps to reflate the Chinese economy, to increase economic growth. That is going to put upward pressure on oil prices. China is buying oil from Russia, and Xi Jinping is visiting Saudi Arabia, and there's going to be a deal between China and Saudi Arabia for more, which will undoubtedly include provision for the supply of more oil from Saudi Arabia to China. China can easily absorb all of Russia's oil exports and still need oil from the Saudis. So we're going to see more pressure from China, putting greater pressure on oil prices before very long. To continue, and this is again, I'm returning to Professor Thompson's article. For much of the 2010s, the world economy got by on the shale oil boom. Without US production more than doubling between 2010 and 2019, the world would have been trapped in a permanent oil crisis since 2005, when conventional crude oil production, oil drilled without hydraulic fracturing or from tar sands, stagnated. But American shale cannot expand at the same rate again. Although the largest US shale oil formation, the Permian Basin in western Texas and southeastern New Mexico, is projected to reach record output next month, overall US output is still more than 1 million barrels per day below what it was in 2019. Even in the Permian, daily production per well is declining. The shale oil boom in the United States, in other words, is in retreat. It's over. More offshore drilling of the kind opened up in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska by the Inflation Reduction Act, a misnamed act if ever there was one, by the way, will require higher prices or investors willing to pour in capital regardless of the prospects for profit. The best geological prospects for a game changer akin to what happened in the 2010s lie with the huge Bazhenov shale oil formation in Siberia. But Western sanctions mean that the prospect of Western oil majors helping Russia technologically is a geopolitical dead end. Now, what Professor Thompson is saying here, by the way, is not that the Bazhenov field won't be developed, but it won't be developed with the participation of the Western oil majors, because they're prevented from doing so by sanctions and geopolitical politics. The Russians, by the way, are familiar with shale oil technology. I mean, they haven't the experience that the US does, but they do know how it works. I know that, by the way, because I know I happen to know one of the engineers I do happen to know is a Russian engineer who is very familiar with the technology. In fact, he's discussed it and explained it all to me, and he's explained to me how it would work. And I know this person, and I know his background, and I know that he is a serious person. Of course, China also has been experimenting with shale. And if Bazhenov is indeed going to be developed, I predict it will be to China's and possibly India's benefit, not for the West. And as we see, Chinese demand for oil at the moment is voracious. And if Chinese economy starts to pick up speed again, and India's does also, then it will only grow. Anyway, to continue with Professor Thompson's article. Second, little can be done that would immediately accelerate the transition from fossil fuels. Britain's planned micro-nuclear reactors will not be completed until the 2030s. Again, a technology, by the way, that looks promising but is yet untested. Running electricity grids on solar and wind-based loads will require technological breakthroughs in storage. It is impossible to plan with any confidence what progress will have materialized in 10 years, let alone next year. But precisely because an energy transition is essential to reduce fossil fuel consumption, that's the mantra now, large-scale blue sky investment is imperative. The only way forward is realism for the short term, recognizing that there is no way back to cheap energy, allied to radical long-term ambition. And now we come to the interesting point. A grasp of geopolitical realities is also essential. The US remains by some distance the world's dominant power. Its naval power guarantees open waters for international trade. World credit markets depend on dollars. But, here's the key. Washington does not have the power to direct China's and India's energy relations with Russia. The coming midwinter will bring a reckoning. Western governments must either invite economic misery on a scale that would test the fabric of democratic politics in any country, or face the fact that energy supply constrains the means by which Ukraine can be defended. Well, there it is. What this article is hinting at, it's very explicit, it's very measured, it's very analytical. What this article is saying, you have to do a deal with Russia. You have to accept the fact you can't dictate energy flows, you can't force India and China to agree to oil price caps or those kind of things. You can't impose your will on the Russians. And you need Russian gas and you need Russian oil for the short term. In the long term, you can work hard to develop your alternative energies. You can build your micro reactors, as the British are talking about. You can work hard on sorting out the energy storage problems with wind and solar power. And of course, this person doesn't talk about hydrogen, but no doubt you can look at that too. In the short term, unless you are going to expose your societies in the West to unbearable pressure, and that doesn't even start with the problems you're going to be creating in the global South. If you are going to try and resolve these problems, you've got to find some way of talking to the Russians. And that means an off-ramp on Ukraine. You've got to accept that you've got to deal with the Russians, address Russian concerns over Ukraine. In other words, Professor Thompson is saying that you've got to talk peace. Now, to me, this is a no-brainer. I've been saying this for months. It's good to see this appear in the Financial Times, where, as I said, they've been advocating more and more sanctions, more and more war. And as I said, it's interesting that it's come alongside an admission in an editorial that the Russian economy has not been broken, that it's still there, that it's still functioning, that it's still able to keep going, that Russia's economy has not completely broken down in the way that some people were expecting or perhaps hoping that it would. So it's good to see that these acknowledgements, these admissions are starting to break through. I'll just quickly say this. This is from the editorial now. This is from the Financial Times editorial. 6 months after Vladimir Putin's aggression triggered the toughest sanctions against Moscow, Russia's economy is holding up better than many had expected. And that's, by the way, a huge understatement. With European populations facing unprecedented heating bill increases, less used to hardship than Russians, and more prone to taking to the streets, Putin may calculate Russia is better placed to withstand the economic pain than many of its Western counterparts. And then he said then the Financial Times says that he would be wrong. Sanctions were never likely to lead to an immediate collapse of the Russian economy. The Financial Times gave very much the different impression at the start. And it goes on to say that costs for Russia will accumulate and that Western democracies will have to persevere. But the fact is, the reality is that, as we've seen, and as that article by Professor Thompson says, whatever pressures the Russians may face, wildly exaggerated, in my opinion, the reality is that in the short term, and it's the short term and the medium term that matters, Russia is still there, it's carrying on, prices in Russia are in decline, shops are full, living standards are stable, employment is stable, Russia is not knocked out, and the West is facing unbearable pressure. A deal needs to be done. Now, there are still, of course, all sorts of people who want to deny this. There's this gentleman, this professor at Yale, Professor Sommerfeld, he's written a long piece about how the situation with the Russian economy is far worse than the Russians are admitting. He's did this study, which I have to say I personally find wildly offbeat. He's appearing in all sorts of places. He's writing in the Daily Telegraph. He's done a recent piece in the Daily Telegraph about how Russia is on the brink of collapse. You can believe that if you will. But it's not providing a solution to the West's energy problems now. Oil and gas are going to be in increasing short supply. With Russia out of the picture in supplying oil and gas to Europe and the United States, the situation is looking dire. And unless Professor Sommerfeld's predictions of a Russian collapse materialize and come true, which I don't think anybody, any policy leader any longer expects, we come back to what the Financial Times says, that sanctions were never likely to lead to an immediate collapse of the Russian economy. if it's not going to collapse immediately or even soon, how do we deal with the problems now? We have to sit down and negotiate. It's, to me, as I said, obvious. I wonder how long it will take before this fact is universally accepted. I see that in Germany itself, there's now growing demands for an opening of Nord Stream 2. It's all been explained as a sort of temporary measure to fill up the gas reserves for the winter. You know, you accept that Nord Stream 1, which the Russians are closing for 3 days, by the way, in order for further maintenance, that Nord Stream 1 is going to be closed. But, you know, let's try and open up Nord Stream 2 and get the Russians to supply us gas through Nord Stream 2 for a couple of weeks, then fill up the reserves, and then we can switch off Nord Stream 2, and then hopefully that will get us through the winter and we can continue that way. I mean, it seems to me crazy thinking, magical thinking again, but at least people are talking about opening Nord Stream 2. Well, if we're talking in that way, surely with the trajectory of travel in Ukraine being what it is, with Ukraine visibly losing, and with the economic crisis in the West deepening, and with these warnings from Professor Thompson that the pressures, the economic pressures, risk doing great damage to the fabric of Western societies and democracies, not to mention what's going to happen in the global South. Well, one way or the other, the time has surely come to put the hardliners to one side, to, you know, listen to Professor Summerfield, but perhaps not Felt, but perhaps not be too swayed by his counsels, and to accept that this hasn't worked and that a deal must be done. Now, postponing this until after the midterms, which are in November, in my opinion, is going to leave it too late. I doubt that Ukraine is going to be able to hold the Russians off until mid-November, even if Ukraine gets its Grey Eagle drones and its ATACMS missiles. I'm sure the Russians will be able to counter those. And of course, by mid-November, the economic crisis in Europe will have developed what quite possibly beyond the point of no return. So let's put all that to one side. Let's instead sit down, negotiate now. Well, I was rather mocking about Macron, but perhaps, just possibly, he might be the first to accept the inevitable and to suggest that this is the moment to start serious negotiations. I doubt it. I don't see any sign of anybody in the West seriously thinking about this, but sooner or later, I suspect that that's what we will have to do. And it's better if it were done sooner than later, if only because so many people will suffer so much if we postpone this. And of course, the danger, as was discussed in that program I did with Scott Ritter and Glenn Deason, which will come out soon, if only because postponing things too long will mean that the Russians will simply win, and at that point dictate terms. Well, this has been another long video, almost an hour long. I'll briefly remind you that you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, and of course Telegram. You can also check us out. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star. You can also go to check out our shop and see the great things that we have there. Our mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, Remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. And be careful, as I said at the start, of anybody who pretends to be me and who clearly isn't. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.